Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Jacqueline Kolnick. I manage the Center for Victim Studies here at ICJIA. And this is, I believe, our fourth Lunch and Learn. They ran a span of topics from a domestic violence outcome measures project, community violence presentation, and now we have one on sexual assault by Dr. Ullman. I'm going to read bios because I have a hard time summarizing them. So Dr. Ullman is a professor of criminology, law, and justice, and affiliate professor of psychology at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She served as director of the Office of Social Research in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences from 2010 to 2015. Dr. Ullman is a social psychologist whose research concerns the impact of sexual assault and traumatic life events on women's health and substance abuse outcomes and rape avoidance prevention. She has received funding from NIMH, NIAAA, and foundations for her research. She's currently conducting an NIAAA-funded longitudinal study of risk and protective factors in sexual assault survivors related to risk of re-victimization, mental health, substance abuse, and post-traumatic growth outcomes. Her book, Talking About Sexual Assault, Society's Response to Survivors, was published by the APA in 2010. So we are so delighted that you are with us. Facilitating our discussion today is Maria Balata from Rape Victim Advocates. She is the advocacy volunteer manager there. She oversees the training and supervision of nearly 200 volunteer medical advocates. She's amazing at it. I used to be one of them. It's the largest rape crisis volunteer network in the state. Additionally, Maria is responsible for managing and implementing the daily functions of the 24-hour crisis response services provided by RVA's 14 partner hospitals. Within that role, she's committed to ensuring each survivor seen in an RVA partner hospital receives prompt, compassionate, and comprehensive services by their volunteer advocates. Since joining RVA in 2012, Maria also served on the advocacy team as a staff medical and legal advocate, where she gained her direct experience in helping survivors navigate medical and criminal justice systems. And she has used this knowledge to ensure that RVA's volunteer training effectively prepares volunteers to work with survivors within these systems, while balancing an understanding of larger systems of oppression. Beyond advocacy and crisis counseling, Maria provides content expertise in the area of queer survivorship. She chairs ICASA's LGBTQ caucus and is committed to ensuring that queer, transgender, and non-binary survivors and activists are visible and included in our movement. Maria holds a master's degree in ethics and a bachelor's degree in political science, and she's able to offer services in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. She's got some very well-rounded people to lead us today. And then we also have Amanda Vasquez, who is a research analyst here in the Center for Victim Studies, but also worked with Dr. Ullman on this project, as well as Ann Kirkner, who is interning at ICJIA and worked on this project. So basically, we love all things Dr. Ullman and borrow greatly from her lab to facilitate things at ICJIA. So today, Dr. Ullman will be talking about sexual assault and help seeking, and from there, I'll take it away to her. And you can also write in your questions if you're on the webinar in the chat field, and Maria will be using some of those for our discussion. No, you can.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Maybe I will hold it up. Just, can you hear me? Is that good? Okay. So I really appreciate the opportunity, and I guess you're moving forward for me. Will you move this? Or oh, I can do it. Okay. Yeah. Okay, good. Where are we? What? Right. Good. Am I good? Yeah. Okay, so thank you so much. It's a great opportunity to come here, and I really appreciate being here. We good? Okay. I just didn't know if you couldn't hear me. Oh, speak a little louder. Yes. So I'm here to talk about sexual assault disclosure and help seeking in women and responses that they get from others that they tell about assault, which most women do. And as most of you may already know, quite a few women are raped in their lifetime, approximately 1 out of 5, according to some recent national data. And most victims of at least adult sexual assault are female. And most assaults, the major injury is the sexual injury that occurs during the assault, and there's typically minor or few other physical injuries in general, statistically speaking. A high percentage, about 81% in recent national research of women experience short and long-term impacts from sexual assault, including PTSD, depression, and poor health outcomes. And this depends on many factors, including severity and other type of factors, so it's not across the board. But there tend to be, significant consequences of sexual assault in women's health. Now, while victims don't always tell other people or report the assault, over time, about 2/3 to 80% of victims across a number of representative sample studies eventually do tell someone, usually an informal source of support, like a friend, family member, or partner. But most do not report to the police. And I think most people are aware of that, and those rates depend on what kind of sample you're looking at, if you're looking at a college sample or a community sample or clinical sample. In one study, recent study, 60% of sexual assault victims sought help from various formal sources, including mental health, medical, and religious sources. So that's pretty good, but it may not be immediate. So that has to be taken into account that, and we're talking about assault-related seeking. Sometimes people may seek help, but they may not discuss the assault, or they may not, people may not screen for it, trying to improve that. So my work has looked at this issue of social reactions. When I started my research, there was a lot of work on clinical sort of recovery, what happens in the survivor's head, sort of, I don't want to say what's wrong with her, but is she blaming herself? Like, what are her characteristics? What's her personality even? There was all this research in that predicts, like, how she responds and recovers or not from sexual assault. And I'm like, as a grad student, I'm like, well, where is the environment around the survivor? There was nothing. It seems very obvious now to look at people's disclosure and reactions to the victim from other people she tells, but there was no research on that. So I actually ended up developing a measure of positive and negative social reactions to victims because I wanted to study it in my research, and funders said, there's no standardized measure, you can't study it. So I had to develop a standardized measure to be able to say, yes, these things happen and they have a significant impact. The Social Reactions Questionnaire was developed in about 2000. It's had an evolution over time, but it's pretty widely used, and we actually have a short version now also. The major types of reactions, categories in a most recent analysis that we find is turning against sort of active, very active, more negative reactions like victim blame, so sort of overt negative reactions. Then we have sort of mixed negative reactions that we call them. We label this, I don't know if it's the best label, but unsupportive acknowledgement. Sort of like, somebody's like not, is taking in that you've been assaulted, but they're still not responding in a supportive way, or maybe they're not responding at all. So they might be distracting you, they might be focusing on themselves and how it's affecting them, but they're not really being supportive, and it comes off as unsupportive, but different than this active, like, you did something wrong, or, why did you go there, or those type of things. And then positive reactions, which range from, obviously everybody knows, being comforting, believing, validating, saying it wasn't your fault, the things we all know that good advocates do, listening, obviously non-judgmental listening. So there's many of those as well. What have we seen in research to date? We've seen, unfortunately, the negative reactions tend to, the more of those that you get as a survivor when you tell different people, and many tell more than one person, you tend to have more negative mental health outcomes like post-traumatic stress, depression, self-blame, and problem drinking. And that's not necessarily the limit of those, but the sort of major ones. Positive reactions are good, but statistically, I'm talking statistically speaking now, when you put things into like a statistical model and see what comes out, positive responses tend to have weak positive relationships with recovery outcomes, or no statistically significant relationships. So it's not that they don't matter, and if you interview survivors, they certainly will say, oh my goodness, this was so helpful, and they'll even sometimes reappraise negative things as positive because they know the person meant well, and that sort of thing. But if you look in actual models controlling various characteristics, negative and positive reactions, the negative reactions predict, and I think this is just because we notice the negative, right? It's sort of like, what do they say about you need 5 atta girls for every you're a piece of, you're a bad girl type thing? We're sort of attuned as people for sort of betrayal or for negative responses, so they tend to be more salient. And obviously there's individual differences in that. You know, not everybody reacts the same way to those. So it doesn't mean positive reactions aren't good, but they may not counterbalance the receipt of negative. And what we've seen, and I'll just add this in, and I can speed it up if I need to, is that the comparing groups of survivors, what you see is survivors who get any negative reactions tend to be worse on the outcomes, even if they get positive reactions too. Those who get only positive are doing the best, you know, who disclose and get only positive responses. And those who don't tell and get nothing are in the middle. So it's just interesting. Disclosure is usually seen as, oh, you need to disclose, you need to seek help, you need to work it through. Yeah, maybe, right? But it sort of depends what you're getting back. So this is in my interest for quite some time. So the most recent study that was being referenced that we did is a 3-year NIH-funded longitudinal survey study with over 1,800 women who had unwanted sexual experiences, age 14 or older, and they had to have told somebody previously. We did put that in because we were looking at reactions and help seeking. In prior research we haven't, and we usually do get people who it's their first time telling anybody. So I don't think I would do that in the future, but the funder was like, wanted that, and that's, you know, it's just better not to do that because it's interesting to see who moves from non-disclosure to disclosure too. Research can be an avenue for that, as other things can. So they're an average of 36 years of age. These were all women, adult women. Majority African American, and this is the Chicago metro area. The study started in 2010 and it just wound up, it was about a 5-year study. Followed by Caucasian and then Asian, multiracial, some other various combinations of other categories, or it's not reported. And then we had a pretty low percentage that reported Latino or Hispanic ethnicity. It was assessed separately. So we have some diversity, but we clearly underrepresent Asian, Latino women. It's not perfect, and we try to get that. We do not translate into Spanish. That doesn't help, probably. So to just come clean about that. And I should also say, the research could be characterized as looking at male perpetration against female victims, although we have asked about gender of the perpetrator, and we do not exclude people, and we do have work that has looked at, we do have lesbian and bisexual women in our sample, and we have measures now of sexual identity, and we are looking at differences based on that now. But, and I can talk about that more if you want to hear more about that. Okay, so we recruit over a year to get a sample that large, the 1,800 plus, through flyers, newspaper ads, you know, online, Craigslist, colleges and universities in the area. Word of mouth is fine, so if people have heard about it and they tell other people, they can call us about the study, and they do need to call us when they see the flyer about describing the study. Again, to verify that they had an unwanted experience, we leave it pretty broad and open, so they define it for themselves. We're not screening what happened on the phone. And they have to then be 18 in this research and have previously told at least one person about the experience. They receive a mailed paper survey. This was a little more old-fashioned. Next time, probably not going to do that. The post office is still in business, thank goodness. I was worried about that. And we mailed them materials, a survey, an informed consent form, a community resources list, and we paid $25 for each survey. So they had 3 over a course of 3 years if they wanted to continue. So then we found, in terms of characteristics, at the initial survey, they had 7 out of 10 women knew the person. This is very common. Most samples show, depending on the sample, that, you know, over half to, you know, 80% of victims know the person who assaulted them, so that's most common. 6 out of 10 happened in the woman's or the man's home. That's pretty typical too. Alcohol use, about half in our sample had been drinking at the time prior to the experience. This again was funded by the Alcohol Institute of NIH. So there's a big focus on drinking because that's, you know, connected to sexual assault. So there's, but not all sexual assault. So that's a whole other can of worms there. Okay, so in 3 out of 10, both the perpetrator and victim had been drinking, or the woman, and in 2 out of 10, only the woman had been drinking. And this mirrors most data where both people are either drinking or only the perpetrator's drinking, and very rarely is the victim alone drinking. And obviously this is not taking into account if they're drugged or, you know, other things like that. We do ask about alcohol and drugs, actually, both. Excuse me? Well, actually, I shouldn't get into that. But there's other issues regarding if they had used substance use or other things, and then other things like incapacitated or the impact of substance use they may or may not know about. I haven't disaggregated that here, but that's also, there's a whole body of research on that as well, right? You may not know you've been drinking, right, or what's in the drink, that sort of thing, which is another huge area that we, do research on. So in the first year, so early on for women, because it ranged to when they had been assaulted, right? We weren't getting them who had only been assaulted like recently. Some of them had been assaulted more recently, but it really varied. And women tend to blame themselves. This is in our research and other research, more closer to the assault, and then self-blame tends to go down over time, just in general, not necessarily for everybody, but that tends to be the trend overall. So often thinking they should have been more cautious or didn't do enough to protect themselves, sort of blaming their own behavior sometimes. And I think that's just the incorporation of societal, like, you're responsible, you're the sexual gatekeeper, you're that type of thing that we internalize as women, like we're supposed to not let this happen, So women, though, who experienced the assault longer ago in the sample, 5 or more years ago, seem to have been doing better. Again, this is a sample of convenience. They're coming forward. It's not a random sample design, because to get a large sample like that would cost even more money. This, already cost over $2 million to do this study. So, so it's, with that caveat. So they could have, they could do more, they felt, to make themselves feel better, those women who had further away from the assault. They said they were more spiritual, had a better understanding of spiritual matters, and more personal strength, like a better ability to handle difficulties, and discovered they were stronger than they had initially thought. So those appraisals of the assault and how you feel change over time, which is not that surprising. Most women, again, had told someone about the experience. When we initially screened people, even though we screened them and said you had to have told somebody, that wasn't as easy to interpret as we thought it would be on the phone. So we did get some that did not, and then we still let them do the survey, but in the analyses about disclosure and reactions, they didn't, have any data about that. Approximately a third told somebody immediately, but many waited a year or after. In all the studies I've done, this is what you see. You see some people tell very quickly, some wait a week or months, and then a whole chunk wait like longer than a year, or sometimes many years before they tell anybody. So that's kind of common. Women were most likely to tell a friend, and almost as likely to tell a romantic partner, and that's pretty typical in this research also. Least likely to tell a priest, minister, and rabbi. In representative samples, what you see is, again, telling informal, telling friends, family, and partners is more common. Typically, medical, legal, and clergy tend to be appraised and rated more negatively, so they tend to be less likely to be told. And it also depends on how, obviously the type of assault. Is it a stranger? Are there a lot of injuries, right? So all of those things feed into what comes to the attention of formal sources sooner or not. Okay, so then we look at social reactions, and this again is at the first wave of data collection. And again, the positive responses that I mentioned, listening, belief, and emotional support, which are related to more positive outcomes. In terms of disaggregating those two negative types I mentioned, the turning against and the unsupportive acknowledgement, we found that the turning against, the more active blame, stigma, or infantilizing, which we found is really bad, right? Survivors don't like responses often, but it depends, of taking control away. They've already lost control from being assaulted. But infantilizing stands out as a piece of controlling reactions. It's like, seems to be even worse, that we found in one analysis we did, because it lowers women's perceptions of control over their own recovery, which is a protective factor, which is really important. And so treating you like a child or acting like you don't know what you're doing, or that tends to be a worse aspect, whereas some people find someone taking control can be helpful. Some people find other controlling reactions aren't. But those are particularly not good. And these reactions that I just mentioned, the blame, stigma, and infantilize, relate to more withdrawing, social withdrawal by the survivor, more self-blame, and less sexual assertiveness. So we looked at assertiveness because that's a risk factor for re-victimization in sort of that context. I also should mention there's the big caveat of intimate partner violence, and I'm not getting into that too much here, but like that changes everything as is in the context of an intimate partner relationship also as well. We're learning much more about. So then the unsupportive acknowledgement, sort of the less negative reactions, distraction, regular controlling type of responses, trying to sort of take charge in an effort to help, but sometimes victims, like that, sometimes they don't. Or egocentric responses like, oh my God, like the parent that's like, oh my God, how could you have done this to us, right? Like it's all about the mom and the girl's like been assaulted, and it's like, what, So So those are related to more positive individual coping, sort of mixed, and more maladaptive or avoidance disengagement types of coping. So more of all types of coping. And then more depressive symptoms and PTSD. So these are interesting to look at separately because they seem to relate to different outcomes. That would need to be replicated, obviously, in more research that needs to be done. So we also looked at alcohol for those women who had been drinking, and we added recently a measure of alcohol-specific social reaction. So what if people knew, or she disclosed there was drinking, or people knew, and then they added certain reactions that went beyond these general social reactions that were related to drinking, like, well, you shouldn't have been drinking, or it's your fault because you're taking these risks. So we came up with this battery of items to try to assess those directly to see if those sort of added on and predicted negative outcomes. And if they disclosed again prior to that they were drinking, we could assess the effect of those. And we basically found that positive reactions, like just because you were drinking, this shouldn't have happened to you, were related to less blaming of your character. There's a weird thing where sometimes people are blaming their character even when they think of drinking as a behavioral thing, right? You should blame your behavior, which maybe you could change, as opposed to blaming my character. I'm just a bad person, so this is why this happened to me. But for some reason, sometimes these alcohol-related assaults lead to these much more characterological, blaming myself as like something's wrong with me as a person or bad about me, even though it's a behavior. So it's a little bit of a disconnect there. But the ones that actively non-blame for it's not your fault even though you were drinking, like do that is a helpful thing for reducing that self-blame. Now, if it's these negative reactions where they're pathologizing her that she was drinking or saying, you were irresponsible, you shouldn't have been there, you shouldn't have been drinking, whatever, because much drinking before sexual encounters and sexual assaults can be consensual, right? You don't know that's going to necessarily lead to an assault. Those relate to more alcohol problems and characterological self-blame, so the negative ones. Well, the positive ones are helping to decrease it, and the negative ones, which is what we would hope. So you could have a reaction related to the fact that they were drinking before the assault that was actually a non-blaming kind of thing. So that's kind of a good thing versus reinforcing the self-blame. That you would want to reinforce the positive ones. And I can't quite hear what you were saying. I'm sorry.
Alcohol is either increasing or decreasing that level of self-blame that was already there.
Yes, I wouldn't necessarily say that. Yeah, I wouldn't say social reactions cause those responses. I think that there's sort of a natural thing where because of how sexual assault's treated differently in society, it's not like, oh my God, somebody robbed me, I shouldn't have had my wallet in my freaking pocket, wow, how stupid am I, blah, blah, blah. Now maybe you shouldn't have, but with sexual assault, that's sort of the go-to place. I'm not saying all women do that, but it's a common reaction because we're taught, we should not be letting this happen. And if it does, we did something wrong. Or at least that's my view of it. Okay. So in terms of the outcomes, other post-assault outcomes, again, I mentioned that these infantilizing reactions, a sort of a subcomponent of controlling responses from other people, tend to decrease perceived control over recovery. It's really good news, Pat Frazier found this initially, that perceived control over recovery is related to better outcomes, not control over whether you got assaulted in the past or whether you're going to get assaulted in the future, but control over your recovery right here and now. And so that's something that we can, right, as advocates or others helping mental health survivors, we can actually do something about, as opposed to, oh my God, I have to change the past or fix the future that I, may not obviously have less control over. So removing those reactions and facilitating control, which of course you guys all know this already, is one thing we want, to be able to gain some sense of control over one's life. And then increase PTSD and problem drinking is what that decreased control relates to, is some of these negative outcomes. So it's important to restore that sense of control. In another area of my research, I look at self-defense training and resistance training, and I think it's the answer, but that is one thing that can sometimes help, even though obviously it doesn't necessarily work for the boyfriend, or there are contexts where that may or not be realistic, so to be honest. And then we have negative reactions in PTSD related to less post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth is sort of those a measure of, good things coming out of bad, so I gained an increased appreciation of life, or, I discovered strengths that I didn't know I had before, or these other kinds of changes that maybe are a response to and a resiliency factor of positive outcomes that can happen, right? You could still be really symptomatic, but you could still have growth, right, from a traumatic experience. They're not mutually exclusive. So again, if we have other positive things, we can facilitate that, and those are here, and I just want to thank you guys for creating all these great graphics, which are really cool. So what's related to that greater or facilitating post-traumatic growth from the experience? This perception of control over one's recovery, receiving more positive social reactions. We might have less control over that. Maybe we target disclosure. If we get lucky, we get the right people, we get more of those. Adaptive individual coping efforts, so efforts to cope emotionally, problem solving, self-regulation, which I don't have in here, like emotionally, learning how to regulate your emotions, right? So we know is, important also. And changing some of those cognitions that may get challenged. So disrupted core beliefs, when we are, as many of you may know from the old just world theory, that somehow you're assaulted, and if you believe the world was fair and everybody was nice and you're a good person, then your world gets shattered by assault or trauma, and then you have to rebuild that assumptive world, or the feeling of worthiness of the self world and others, which one could question based on, because you may never felt that way in the first place. So there's some issues with that theory, but it does relate to more post-traumatic growth. So some change is possible there. Is growth going to happen? I mean, we have a bias in some of these measures, right, where everybody's supposed to, how are you doing, like you're supposed to say you had some growth. I mean, who's going to say I had no growth? I had negative growth. So, I mean, there's been critiques of this, but I still think it's important to look at positive outcomes, because the traditional literature is focused a lot on psychopathology, historically speaking. Okay, so then we look at the interview data. After the 3 ways of surveys, we got survivors who were interested in doing interviews, and then through them, we got them to nominate people in their social network to do separate interviews. We got 45 matched pairs of survivors, and either a family member, friend, or partner that did interviews, again, separately, about the survivor's experience of disclosing, and responses and support that went back and forth there. So that was 90 interviews, many of which Amanda did, and Ann, and a lot of years of work for that, actually, to do that and code that qualitative data. Interesting new things beyond social reactions that we found in some of these matched pairs. Parentification up there, that in family pairs, like say a mother disclosed to a child, right, or the child just found out or whatever, that this had happened to her, the children felt like they had to grow up more quickly, and they're adults now when they're doing these interviews, so they're looking back at, what that was like, and take on more responsibilities before they are emotionally ready to do so. So there was that interesting effect, sort of these relationship effects. Sons particularly spoke of needing to care for their mothers and grow up fast, or, take on almost a more adult-like role when that had happened. The role of past trauma was another theme that came from these interviews. Now, it isn't always true, but it can be true that if you can draw on your experiences related to this, you can be in a unique position to be supportive, to the extent that maybe you've dealt with it, right? I would put a qualifier on that, I think. But they talked of support persons here in their interviews of being able to respond to survivors because of their own personal experience with trauma. So friend tells a friend, and the other friend's been assaulted, and she gets it because it's happened to her, and so she knows, like, how to be more supportive, hopefully, not always, but hopefully. Or sons saying they drew on seeing, or I can think of actually a husband more, maybe, I don't know if it were sons, but a husband who grew up in a violent family and saw what happened to his mom, and so he totally got it. Like, he learned about gender violence, and he drew on that then to help his female partner later in life who had been assaulted, and like just kind of had a good instinct about how to treat her, and that sort of thing. So that, that can be a positive thing to draw on. That came out. Betrayal trauma, I sort of mentioned that a little bit earlier, sort of this notion of having a violation that goes further, of violating the survivor's trust or well-being. So think of, like, there's a group of friends, and one of the friends assaults another friend, and then they believe the assailant over the victim. So the victim kind of gets pushed out of the friendship network, that kind of thing, because you got to choose sometimes, maybe not all the time. So, but just having people either reject you or tell other people, you know, behind your back, and you didn't, you know, it was confidential. So this can be very, very harmful, and we know this from, you know, child abuse research, right? That, you know, betrayal by the trusted other, the parent, leads to a lot of negative outcomes for child abuse survivors. I should say many of these people, not all, also have a history of other types of traumas and other childhood traumas, and we've looked at that. Also, we account for that in this research as well. It's not just the sexual assault. So impact of disclosure, we were really interested, you know, how did this affect the family, friend, and partners who heard about the assault and were trying to help the survivor? So there were emotional effects that they talked about, sadness, feeling triggered, anger that this had happened, and being inspired at the survivor's disclosure. So there were some negative and some positive, but there were definitely effects of hearing about the assault of one's friend, family, partner, and some expressed active cognitive and behavioral impacts to disclosure. So they had more awareness or realization about assault and its risk, and that this happens, you know, by that, and they you know, could have done good or bad things in response to that. So some people pull away from the survivor and can't deal with it or don't want to deal with it, don't know how to. Some may engage in caretaking. You know, that can actually reinforce some codependency almost sometimes, like even in some of these interviews that we really kind of saw as a theme. It can be a positive. It can also go too far, you know, sacrificing your whole life, you know, to take care of your mom or something like that. And then educating others or intervening in problematic situations. So just really realizing I have to be part of the solution. I need to help in an active way to stop sexual violence and to make others aware of this problem. Did the support people, informal people we interviewed, seek help to cope with being told about the assault? About a little over half did seek help from someone else, a third from a formal source, 26% from informal, and 22% from both types of sources. So yes, some of our interviewees, again, it's a small qualitative sample, did seek help to deal with that. But why did just under half not seek help, given they really did express significant emotional and cognitive and behavioral responses to this disclosure? They didn't notice necessarily the impact of the disclosure. Sometimes the survivor noticed how it was affecting her partner or her family member and realized that, and the supporter maybe wasn't as aware of that necessarily, or sometimes in our interviews, by the end, they sort of started being like, I think maybe I need to talk to somebody about this. Like they'd sort of come to that realization even more. Maybe they didn't think it was needed, concerned it would be a violation of the survivor's trust. So some were concerned, like, I can't go seek help because, like, that's like I can't do that. That's not okay for her, wanting to protect her, and unaware who could help. Like, you know, the services and help should be for the victims, like not knowing they could actually call or get help from a hotline or from another source of support. So clearly, you know, from this qualitative work and other work that we already know that's out there on vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress in the professional literature and other research literature, you know, that this does affect other people. There's a radiating impact, right, of violence against women and sexual assault, and it does affect others around the survivor as well. So they need services geared toward them to be able to, you know, discuss their feelings safely and get validation. Then finally, we got data from survivors' recommendations. We actually asked supporters about this too. It's like, what needs to be done? What do survivors need? What should we be doing? So here from the survivor part, we got that data both on the surveys of the 1,863 survivors and then also the follow-up interviews with the 45 pairs. Survivors recommend telling someone. Now, of course, these people have told somebody as an artifact of, you know, being in the study, so they're going to keep that in mind. Not keeping it to themselves or isolating from other people. Telling people who seem safe and supportive, who have training or personal experience with trauma. So they're pretty much like, you know, there's some discretion needed there, right? I mean, advising, like, don't just randomly go off telling anybody. And this really varies for different survivors. I'll never forget, and I think I've said this to you guys before. I remember this one survivor that I interviewed. This was in a past study, and she goes, I tell everyone, it's a litmus test, and if they don't respond well, they're out of my life. And I was like, wow, you know, it's like there's a really bold response, and I was like, you know, you can hear that from many people, but I thought it's a very different approach, like not being concerned like who's going to be supportive and try to be more selective, that I think, you know, a lot of survivors might feel very betrayed when somebody they thought was going to be there for them suddenly isn't. So those expectations can be, key. So wanting somebody who has specialized knowledge or at least an understanding and empathy about this issue, clearly survivors want that. And some people have that and some don't. Survivors wish there was consequently more education for young people. More, as we know, we need more training for law enforcement and other formal support providers. They're medical and legal and others are trying to do their jobs, and we know from research that sometimes the way that they have to do their jobs can interfere with being supportive to survivors. So there's like a real issue there. They're surely trying to harm them, but there is issues there for the way that we deal and respond to sexual assault. So it's an issue that is ongoing that people in the field are well aware of. And there are very, very good people, and then there are people who just don't, and it's also a resource issue of needing to have training and resources available so people understand that in the medical arena and the legal arena. Key finding for advocacy groups to include survivor input when planning community outreach and education. We have all this stuff on trauma-informed, services and trauma-informed. It's a bit ill-defined, I guess, and sometimes it isn't actually survivor-informed. I was kind of surprised. Mary Koss, who was a pioneering rape researcher some years ago, was giving an address at APA, and she's like, we don't have, I can't find anything on survivors' voice in research and what the survivors say they want, and so this is why we analyze this in our data. I was sort of like, of course we have to have that. We have all this information from interview data and research, but I guess we didn't have so much of like what the survivors say they want and other survivors need, as I thought maybe. So it's really important to get that. Seems sort of obvious, but I don't know that it's always happening. Or is it the professional sort of, this is from the clinical world coming down of this is what is best practice, right? Which might or may not completely converge with what sexual assault survivors need. Additional research, this is not comprehensive, but I'm just relating it to what I've talked about. Obviously this alcohol-related assault thing is a can of worms, as I mentioned, that can be more problematic and much more difficult and obviously doesn't do well in the legal system and other arenas and is often unacknowledged or not labeled assault. And the reactions and disclosures of them. We need much more about this because it's not like it doesn't have an effect just because you were drinking and it wasn't like he held you down by force and there was, the sort of more traditional model. Survivors are affected, even with less so-called coercive strategies, and there's significant trauma also with alcohol-related sexual assaults and other things that pile on to that, giving all our sort of myths surrounding alcohol and sexuality and gender in our society. Underrepresented groups, okay, I didn't talk about that much, but we're doing research on race, ethnicity, on sexual orientation and sexual identity, and really we do need more research to really understand, an intersectional perspective to understand survivors' experience rape. It's not the same if you're a middle-class white woman who gets raped on the dorm in the college campus, and you're a poor woman living on the south side of Chicago, African-American, who's like, fighting for your life and your children and exposed to all kinds of traumas and stressors and low resources and et cetera. So context is really, really important, and research needs to do better in this area of taking account of context, mine included. Okay, so then translating research to practice, and you guys know this, we need research and practice that's research informed, but we also need research to practice research informing, and unfortunately, the good and the bad is we've gotten more specialized and knowledgeable than we've got all our little niches, and it's harder sometimes to get those connections to happen. But I think that's key to what can really help survivors and educate and try to prevent not just assault, but also the secondary kinds of prevention, reducing negative reactions, getting better help for survivors, and equipping other people to help, because we know informal people who are told can often facilitate or thwart the survivor getting help. That is a key factor that's in there. It's not all the time, but it is a thing. So they're just not going to show up at the police or I'll call the crisis line or that kind of thing. So we need to do this work also. And then evaluating support network interventions, and then I'm almost done, to reduce these negative reactions. And Dr. Katie Edwards, who's at University of New Hampshire, and I are about to, I think, receive an NIH grant, which is exciting, to evaluate an intervention to try to look at, and this isn't a student sample initially, but try to look at this issue of, how can we improve the disclosure and social reactions for both sides of that and try to help people in coping and responding to the disclosure and do an intervention around this to see, can we teach people and help people who are facing needing to tell somebody or get help, but also those who are trying to respond and help the person who's had this experience. And a dialogue between researchers, practitioners, and okay, I already sort of said that. Obviously, we need that. I appreciate you guys inviting me and look forward to hearing more and learning from you. So that's kind of it. Thank you.